Let's dive in. What book are we in? 1 John. What chapter are we in? 2. Yeah, nice. We're still in chapter 2, still in the same section that I started last week. This is part 2 of that sermon. So, remember in chapter 2, there's two halves to the book of John. The first one is characterized by the message, God is light, and the second one is kind of characterized by the message, God is love. And there's 5 exhortations in that first part, and we're in the second of those 5. And we've been talking about obedience. Yeah, wasn't that fun? Remember that John uses the word keep, right? Keep Jesus' commandments, keep his word. And that goes beyond obedience. You know, today, when we say obedience, it usually carries this, it's usually separate from what your attitude is while you're obeying, right? That's usually like the connotation, the way we use it. You know, you hear people talk about, well, you know, I did what he said, right? I did it, but I didn't like it, right? So at least in my experience, that's usually how we use the word. We don't necessarily imply that there was willingness or not willingness, just that it was done. And John doesn't use that word because he wants to, I think, get across the point that the attitude matters. He uses this word keep, and the way he uses it and the way it's used in the Old Testament and elsewhere in the New Testament, it implies this duration and perseverance, right? Observing diligently, guarding carefully, protecting this truth that you've realized, and just being really zealous about doing God's will. And John, in the verses we talked about last week, John went on to say that our obedience should come from a place of love, and that love for God, and that as we obey, that love is perfected. He used the word perfected, translated, it's perfected, but it kind of means completed, accomplished, fulfilled. Because, you know, something that's perfect is complete, right? Doesn't need any more. And so, but that's the meaning behind that. In other words, he's not saying that we must be, or to be true Christians or something, perfect in how we obey God's commandments. Does that make sense? So he is saying, though, that a person who truly knows Jesus and is really connected to him, by definition, keeps Jesus' commandments. Right? He said, if and we'll read it again in a minute, but he was saying, if we say we know him, then we should keep his word. And it's by definition. Why? Because, so John believes that the promises of the Old Testament are fulfilled in Jesus. And so do I, by the way, but I'm just saying it that way. That we're trying to hear what John is saying to us and what the Spirit is saying to us through this, right? And so John, he believes that the Old Testament promises are fulfilled in Jesus, and that Jesus came to fundamentally transform those who believe into him into a new kind of human. A new kind of human. Because, you know, the Old Testament is a lot of things, but one of the things it is a long story of humanity always striving to be this ideal and perpetually failing to reach it. Most of the time, not getting very close. There's some glimpses, there's some bright moments, but most of the time it's just failing to do that. And the Old Testament authors recognized from early on, starting with Moses in Deuteronomy, that something fundamental would have to change, right? And so I'm just going to go through these really quickly, but these are 3 key things that the Old Testament, you know, starts and then picks up in a couple other places. So Moses says in Deuteronomy 30 that there'll come a time when God will he's talking to the Israelites before they enter the promised land. Remember, Deuteronomy is kind of his farewell speech. And he says, God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring so that you will love the Lord God with all your heart and with all your soul. he's saying something fundamental has to change inside. And then hundreds of years later, Jeremiah picks that up. In Jeremiah 31, he says, he uses a different metaphor, but he's talking about the same thing. He says, speaking as a prophetic word from God, God saying, I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they'll be my people. And he goes on to say, at that time, no one will say to the person next to him, hey, you need to know the Lord, because everybody's going to know him. It's just going to be written in their hearts. And then lastly, Ezekiel, some decades later, he talks about, God says, I'm going to put a new spirit within you. I'm going to take out your heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh and a new spirit. And so again, he's talking about a fundamental, all three of these guys are talking about the same thing. What humanity needs is to be fundamentally transformed from the inside. And when that happens, then everybody is going to obey the Torah, the instruction that he gave. It's not going to be something that only we strive to do and can't do, that maybe Moses came close, maybe David on a good day. It's not going to be like that. And John and the apostles and the New Testament authors all saw that Jesus was coming to fulfill those promises, and that those that believed in him were fundamentally transformed. That's why John says that if you know him, you'll keep his commandments. You'll keep his word. That's by definition what's going on, right? And so Jesus taught that too, by the way. In Matthew, there's several places. I'm just going to talk about one. Matthew 7, verse 21 through 23. I used to be really scared of these verses. They still give me some trepidation, but I'm not as scared of them as I used to be. But they are sobering words from Jesus. And he says, not everyone who says to me, Master, Master, will enter the kingdom of heaven. But who? The one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do mighty works in your name? It's not too shabby stuff right there. And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Notice Jesus' choice of words. He says that it's the ones who do the will of his Father in heaven. And he says, I don't know you because you're a worker of lawlessness. He's talking about the same thing that John's talking about. That by definition, that's who we are now. And John, in his context, of the book of 1 John, is asking the people in his churches to recognize that as well. That there's this faction, remember this, there's this faction that is kind of claiming this spiritual authority, but they're living like hell. And they think it's okay because, hey, my spirit's fine, and so my flesh, it doesn't matter what it does. Sin is of no consequence. Only the spirit matters. And they had this screwed up theology. And John is saying, people that are completely, separating that, can they really say they know Jesus? The answer is no. So I talked about this all last week, the obeying part. But I just want to make sure that it's that, and I left you deliberately. I left you in a place, I hope, of just, being examined by the Spirit, letting him talk to you about where you're at with that. But I'm not talking about then, John isn't talking about, I'm not talking about that we have to struggle and strive to obey and do this kind of all on our own, right? His Spirit enables us to do that. He does the heavy lifting. But what I did ask was, are you cooperating? Are you cooperating, or are you fighting it? And in any area of your life, because I think that it's probably, it's true for me, it's probably true for most of us, that we have areas in our life that we're like, oh yeah, and other areas, oh, don't bring that one up. I'm still fighting. If I'm honest, I'm still fighting God on that one a little bit, or two or three, or more. And so what is God saying about that? Maybe he's saying, are you tired of fighting me yet? You want to go another round? Are you kicking against the goad? Right. Remember, I use these words justification and sanctification and glorification as kind of like ways to describe pieces of our salvation process. I don't know what other words to use. That at one point we're redeemed, we're justified in the sense that all sin is canceled, the debt is canceled. But then there's this process of sanctification where we work that out and we get transformed by him. And the deal is if we're accepting the one, we're committing to be involved in the other. We can't say, oh, I just want part A, God, and then after that I want to just live my own life, leave me alone. We can't do that and then expect glorification at the end. And so now in the next few verses, remember John in his in this book uses this kind of technique of like amplification, where he talks about the same thing from different sides and just kind of repeated in cycles, and by repetition he just kind of makes his point, hit home. And so he goes on to refine this whole thing and to expand this whole thing about obedience. So let's read these verses again, and I'm going to start at the beginning of this section in verse 3 in chapter 2. And the first 4 verses are what we covered last week, and then we'll get into the ones for this week. So verse 3. And by this we know that we have come to know him, if we keep his commandments. Whoever says, I know him, but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected or completed. And by this we know that we are in him. Whoever says he abides in him, in other words, that is connected and kind of dwelling in Jesus, and Jesus is dwelling in him, that whole thing. Whoever says that they're doing that ought to walk in the same way in which he, Jesus, walked. Verse 7. Beloved, and he switches tone here a little bit to something personal. Beloved, I am writing you no new commandment, but an old commandment that you had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word that you heard. At the same time, it is a new commandment that I am writing to you, which is true in him and in you, because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. Let's talk about that for a second. He says, I'm not writing you a new commandment, but I kind of am. Right? What is he talking about? I think, just even from the language he uses, let alone the themes, that once again he's been reflecting on things that Jesus said during the last meal he had with them. Remember, John is writing decades later, and he alone of all the apostles died a natural death. And after some decades of reflection, these are the things that he's coming to. And in John 13, he says this in a couple places, in John 15 as well, but this is the one I want to read for us, to mention for us. Verse 34 and 35, this is Jesus speaking to his disciples at that Last Supper. He says, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So I think John is reflecting on that when he says, I'm writing you no new commandment, but an old commandment that you had from the beginning. The beginning of what? Is he talking about the beginning of, the Bible? Like, yeah, this whole thing about love your neighbor is in the Pentateuch. Maybe. I kind of think he's talking about from the beginning of like when he started the church. This is the same message I've always been preaching to you. So it's not a new commandment. But then he says, yeah, at the same time it is a new commandment. And it's new because there's this new empowering force. It's new because the scope is bigger. Jesus said, just as I have loved you, you should love one another. That's the standard. And now he's transformed our hearts, and there's this new empowering. So I think that's why he's saying it is new. It's not new, but it is new. We're supposed to have been doing this, but since love your neighbor as yourself, since the Torah was handed down at Mount Sinai, but it is also new because of what Jesus brought to it. And this phrase, because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. John is expecting that the church is going to exhibit the real presence of Christ so powerfully that he's using language about the end of an age and the beginning of another age. Right? The darkness is passing. The true light has already come. I mean, how different are darkness from light? Is darkness from light? Pretty different, right? We even have phrases like as different as night and day to describe things that are fundamentally or radically different. And John is expecting that when we love one another, it's going to be so different that it's like saying the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. It's the transition into a new era. Let's read on. Verse 9, whoever says he is in the light and hates his brother is still in darkness. Whoever loves his brother abides in the light, and in him there is no cause for stumbling. But whoever hates his brother is in the darkness and walks in the darkness and does not know where he is going because the darkness has blinded his eyes. You see what I'm saying? He's repeating things, saying them a different way on purpose to kind of drive these points home and to kind of amplify this idea. Whoever says he's in the light and hates his brother is still in darkness. Whoever loves his brother abides in the light, and in him there is no cause for stumbling. Stumbling there is the Greek word scandalon. We do get the word scandalous or scandalize from that. Our word scandalizes means something a little bit different than this Greek word, but that is where we get our word. And literally, and if anybody has read or remembers, sermons in years past about, from the book The Bait of Satan, about offense, you'll remember this, that the word scandalon, in the literal meaning, okay, is the stick or trigger of a trap, right? Maybe you set a little cage and you have the little stick there and the animal knocks it over and boonk. Or they step into a snare and hit some kind of trigger and up in the air you go, right? That's what it is literally, a snare, an impediment, something placed in the way to cause someone to stumble or something to stumble or fall. And so that's where it gets its metaphorical meaning, right? The metaphorical meaning is any person or thing which is entrapped or drawn into error or sin. Any person or thing by which one is entrapped. So the scandalon is the thing that causes you to be drawn into error or sin, that entraps you. It's that offense that just leads your heart down some wrong way. It's that thing that just causes you to just lose your way, to fall into some error that tempts you, and then you just give in, right? That's this thing. And John is saying that whoever loves his brother abides in the light, and in him, person who's loving his brother, there's no cause for stumbling. There's no cause for stumbling. The way this person lives his or her life by loving his brother doesn't cause someone else to be drawn into error or sin. And we'll get to more about that later. So that's the end of this section. He's just talking about loving one another. Easier said than done, right? If you don't think it's easier said than done, then maybe you haven't met enough people. So, what is the standard that John mentions for loving one another? Pop quiz. What's the standard? The way that Jesus loved us. Absolutely. The way that Jesus loved us. Paul picks up on this, Philippians 2, and talks about it. We'll read it here. Philippians 2, verse 3. He's telling the Philippians about loving one another. And he says, "Do nothing for selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves." Count others more significant than yourselves. "Look each of you not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others." And then, perhaps remembering the standard, he says this: "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men." You may have heard these verses before, maybe lots of times, but just hear them again with fresh ears. "Being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted," Paul just can't help going off on this a little bit. "Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that in the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of the Father." And then he kind of comes back to his point. It says, "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling." He's talking about sanctification. Work out your salvation. It's not being saved by works, but it does mean you got to work this thing out. Like God's asking me to do this, or God is asking me to not do that. God wants me to change my thinking, wants me to change my attitude, and I got to wrestle with it. He says, "Work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure." So he says, consider others more important, more significant than yourselves. Look after other people's interests, not just your own. And he says, remember, that's what Jesus did. Remember, that's what Jesus did. That's his point. Remember that Jesus didn't consider being God as something that he needed to hold on to. That Jesus set aside power and authority for us. That he humbled himself. That he served us. That he died for us. That's the standard. That's the standard. So, when you think about how you should love one another, first think about, what did Jesus do with his status and authority? How did he use his influence? Did he come to be served? How did he spend his time and energy? Whose benefit did he seek? There's places in the Gospels where he seems like he's just struggling to get a moment alone. But he knows that people are in need. There's one place where he wants a moment alone, but he sees, he has compassion. It says because they were like sheep without a shepherd. When it came to placing others above himself, where did he draw the line? Did he say, I'll do this for you, but not more? How did he react when he was rejected or when he was betrayed? How long was it before he knew that Judas was the one that was going to betray him? Was it from the beginning? I don't know. I know that shortly after feeding the 5,000, he knew. And everything I read about him in the Gospels says that he didn't treat him any different. Didn't start to shun him. You're the guy who's gonna. I hate you. I don't like you. Think about just God's commitment to humanity in the stories of the Old Testament. I mean, we're rarely getting it right. Abraham was told to go to Canaan, and as soon as he got there, he left for Egypt. He abused one of his slaves to get a son. He had his bright moments too. But in all that, he goes to Egypt. He lies about Sarah. It says that she's not, she's my sister. She's not my wife because he's afraid for his own life. That's why. Hangs her out to dry to save his own skin. But God just like doubles down and tells the Egyptian Pharaoh, hey, watch it, buddy. That's a married woman. Like, he had the consequences for Abraham's boneheadedness. It's just a small example. You see what I'm saying? Think about all the things that any of those, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And Jacob was always wheeling and dealing, trying to get something. Think about David. There's a lot of bright moments, but there's just a lot of God's like committed. He's committed to staying by us, to rescuing us. And so if that's who he is, and if we should love just as he loved us, and then the person of Jesus, he demonstrated all that in the flesh. Like, he served his disciples. His best friends were thieves. The tax collectors were thieves, prostitutes, beggars, people that were hurt. Those are like his people they like to hang out with. He'd hang out with anybody, but he really liked hanging out with them because they knew that they needed him. That's the standard that we have to love one another. The command to love one another, by the way, is also includes seeking reconciliation. So it's not just I need to love the people that are around me, love well the people that are around me, or that that I'm still in a relationship with. But it includes those people, that person that you just had a falling out with, whether it was last week or last decade. And I know it's two-way street, all that stuff, right? Sometimes there's only so much you can do, etc. I'm not talking about the other person. I'm talking about you. I'm talking about me. you or I can do. And so when Jesus says love one another, that includes seeking reconciliation. Because, I mean, we're all still figuring this out, right? So we're all still going to have these rifts. That's still possible, right? And sometimes they're big and they take a lot of work to repair, to clean up the mess, as Mike said 2 weeks ago. You walk into a room, you spill paint everywhere, you got to clean up your mess. Who do you spill paint on? You got to clean that up. But whether it's big or small, it includes that. Now, I do want to say a couple things about the other side of the coin. Just because maybe you're thinking that, and if you're not, you probably will at some point. And especially if the enemy tries to make a terrible suggestion that there's some kind of wiggle room in something God's asking you to do. Where have I seen him do that before? Did God really say? So, yeah, I know that we shouldn't be naive when we say love one another. We shouldn't be naive about people that would hurt us, for example. Like that's a legitimate question. Like where's the boundary line of, I'm just subjecting myself to abuse. Jesus said something interesting to his disciples when he sent out the 12. He sent out 12 one time, another time 70 or 72, depending on which gospel you're reading. He sent out a larger group. But when he sent out the 12, he says this. He says, Matthew 10:16, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents, yet innocent as doves. He says, you still got to be wise, but in that wisdom, it's not about just being hard or being manipulative or any of those things, right? It's still just innocent, pure hearts. And also the call to obey the Lord and obey what He's asking. I know that's been abused by church leaders too, right? So I know that those things are out there, and mostly I don't know if you've ever tried preaching a sermon in 45 minutes or so. It's not that easy to talk about all sides of a coin all the time, and you just run out of time. And most of the time, like today, there's one side of the coin I want to focus on, not the other, because I think that's the word that's what this word is about. But I do know that other side is out there. I just want to say a couple things about it. One is, what I just said. I know. I mean, the church I grew up in my early 20s, big bad split. All but one of all my friends left with the pastor who was not just doing immoral things, but illegal things. And they all said, well, it's God's authority, blah, blah, blah. So I don't need to be told that that's possible. But the exceptions don't determine the rule, right? And I observe, and I can't make this determination for anybody about what you're willing to subject yourself to for the love of someone else. In certain cases, I can think of certain cases where I might give some advice to stop some stuff. But I observe that Jesus went to great lengths to love and to serve. He put himself last. He was willing to be beat over the head and abused and killed. He was willing to be called names Can you imagine if you're like a really good person and somebody just starts assaulting your character, says you're a liar and you're a cheat and you're a whatever, any number of things, and multiply that times like infinity. What it felt like Jesus to be said, hey, you're doing this by a demon. I mean, it's a horrible thing to say to anyone. To anyone in who's just, a righteous person. But then Jesus, really? Anyway, he went to great lengths. He went to great lengths to love those around him. To heal somebody's ear during his arrest. I mean, that's pretty powerful. He was completely selfless. So, while I know, and I recommend, I know that there's, scenarios where like, man, are you really sure you want to do that for this person? You're really opening yourself up to this or that. But it's hard for me, I'm just saying, it's hard for me to say with certainty in just, well, this kind of case, that kind of case, you shouldn't do it. Because, man, when the Lord's asking you to lay down your life for someone, you should do it. And that's the most important thing. If you're in a particular situation and you think it's tough, pray about it. Say, Lord, do I need to set a boundary here? Is setting a boundary really the best thing for that person? Because it could be. It could be what they need. The thing that's going to bring them closer to God. But it could also be, I have dignity that you've given me, Lord, and I'm going to let this person violate that boundary because that's what they need right now. It's okay if they yell at me. It's okay if they call me a name, or it's okay, you know what I'm saying? And so just ask the Lord for that. Don't assume that he has the same boundary that you do. This is a hard word, guys. Like, I know it's a hard word, because if we're really thinking about it, because it's easy to love someone that we are get along with well. That's someone that's same age or same life circumstance or whatever. But it's difficult when button heads, when there's big cultural differences, when there's massive wounding or immaturity on one or both sides, all that stuff. But I want to say that if we're following Jesus' example, we shouldn't give up too easily. And I want to challenge you that you're capable in and through the Spirit of more than you think. Let me say that again. You are capable in and through this. This is not, he's doing the heavy lifting, but you do got to put yourself out there. But you're capable in and through the Spirit of more than you think when it comes to loving one another, when it comes to laying down your life for somebody else. I'm talking metaphorically. Sure, there's cases where you might do that literally, but I'm talking about what is laying down your life. It's your rights matter less than you don't need to say, well, I'm going to take my right to do this. I'm going to give up my right to do that. I'm going to say, yeah, I'll give up my time and energy to help you with this or help you with that. Right? It's all these little things where you're saying, what Paul said, I'm considering you more significant. I'm looking out than me. I'm looking out for your interests over mine. And in a community of love, that works out because you're looking after my interests and I'm looking after your interests, and it's great. But even when there's not reciprocation, that's not, Jesus didn't say only if they love you back, right? That's not really what love without strings means. So you're capable of more than you think. And I want to end with this thought. John saw a community loving one another so well that he described it as a new age, as darkness. He described it in terms of the dawn, right? Of the darkness passing away and the light has come, like something that radical. And so that's the thought I want to end with. Let's show Jesus to the world by loving one another in such a radical way that it can only be described as, man, those people are like, they're from a different world. They're just living with a completely different value system. That upside down kingdom that we talk about so often. It'd be such radical love that what Jesus said would be seen, that they would know we're Christ's followers from that.